I'd just like to start by just welcoming you all, and I'm going to immediately pass over to Ayaki Ito, who is the Director of the Division of Emergency Security and Supply at UNHCR. So thank you, Ayaki.
I'm very honored to host this important forum. The rise of armed drones' impact on humanitarian operations and security risk management. And I would like to thank GISF, WFP, and Insecurity Insight for partnering with the UNHCR to convene this very important and timely discussion at the UNHCR headquarters. It's a very sunny Sunday, but we're at the basement. But I'm sure that we will have a very good discussion. I just want to recall my own recent mission to Eastern Chad a couple of weeks ago. And I saw many refugees who just arrived from Darfur with gunshot wounds and a lot of injuries from the conflict on the way to flee. And they talk about bombing and Zamzam camps, El Fashir, and elsewhere. They didn't really distinguish. It was a shelling, it was a drone, it was whatever. But the fear is there. And everybody knows that the drones are used by warring factions there. And some people talk about fear from the sky. And this is something new to those who have been in this humanitarian work for some years. And in 2024 alone, there were over 300 documented incidents where drone delivered explosives disrupted humanitarian operations. This is 4 times more than the previous years. So this is a crossroads. We have to really put our heads together, how to respond to these developments. So this is a very, very important forum, I believe. So today, I would like to just propose 3 things to discuss. First of all, how humanitarian organizations can adapt security risk management to meet weaponized drone threats. And secondly, explore the role of states, explore the role of states, multilateral organizations, NGOs, civil society, and other partners to strengthen protection of civilians and upholding humanitarian principles. And thirdly, and discover pathways for collective advocacy for policy engagement to close the legal normative gaps. Thank you. Here we are talking about not only security of humanitarian workers, we are talking about multifaceted issues, certainly the civilian protection, security of humanitarian workers, humanitarian access, and also humanitarian diplomacy. It is a very complex issue, and that's why we have distinguished guests from different corners of the world and different parts of the international community. And I would like to also thank all the guest speakers today and also participants in person here as well as connected remotely. Just to conclude, also remind ourselves, behind all the numbers, statistics, we have a human face. Often we forget in these discussions. We're talking about refugees, displaced people, civilian population, and also our colleagues, humanitarian workers on the ground. I understand also colleagues here in person or remotely connected in those places. So let us also remember that we have a human face behind these numbers. Just conclude again, thank you very much for gathering today, and then I will look forward to a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
I hope it's working without any beep, but thanks very much. Bonjour, good morning. I would like to thank my UNHCR colleagues for hosting this important conference. We have worked very closely together with, of course, UNHCR, GISF, and Insecurity Insight to put the conference together. I wanted to acknowledge the hard work of all colleagues contributing, while all our organizations are undergoing severe cuts and restructuring, while attending simultaneously to major operational emergencies in the world. And of course, we mentioned already in the pre-briefing Yemen and Gaza. I'm grateful to all speakers in the room and online, as we have managed to bring together a cross-cutting team present, not only exactly in the room, but also, and I hope the colleagues online are hearing me. We have many colleagues joining us from field operations, and this is indeed attesting to the importance and timing of the initiative. Today, we will look at the impact of militarized drones, bring in speakers from NGO, INGO, GISF, UN agencies, think tanks, researchers, practitioners, trainers, as well as member states. Quite a long list there. This wealth of experience will help us see the issues from many different angles, and in particular, the security risk management and the need for higher level advocacy. And I cannot stress this more, higher level advocacy. I have just joined WFP as Security Division as Director, having spent 2 years in Ukraine, where drone strikes have been continuous for years, and where drone warfare have enormously evolved. We can speak during the different sessions about the first-person view drones, about the radio-controlled ones, about the fiber optic controlled ones, about the Shaheds, about the Gerans, and so on and so on. And I know Mimi can provide very good experience on this one also. Prior to Ukraine, I was Director of Aviation at UNHCR, and of course also looking at drones for additional cargo capability transport. So I have some experience about that, and in addition, of course, I'm a pilot. The growing use of drones introduced unprecedented risks for civilians and humanitarian operations. The use of armed drones challenge our personnel, our beneficiaries, and our operations. At WFP, we have recorded more than 20 incidents related to drone strikes the last months only, involving ourselves, our partners, our beneficiaries. And this is just the top of the iceberg, as documenting drone strikes, like what you were mentioning, is very challenging. They are anonymous and nearly invisible weapons. Confirming a drone strike is not always feasible, and getting relevant details about the types of drones used and the methodology used is even more complicated. We are all struggling to manage the threat. We will be discussing in details during the 3 sessions today on what we can do at the operational level. But for more efficiency, we need to go beyond our own remits, involving member states, governments, and manufacturers. And this will be the topic of the last session today. Given the volume and frequency of drone strikes affecting targeting humanitarian actors, we fear and expect this trend to increase. A whole industry has developed and is further developing, and conflict areas, humanitarian operations, are sadly so used as training grounds for these developments. We need to find collective answers. I wish for all actors present today here in Geneva and online during debates to remain engaged and share their experience, and guidance. This is key to ensure we scale up the safety and security of operations, personnel, beneficiaries, and operations. I thank you for your presence, and I'm also looking forward to a very fruitful discussion, brainstorming, hoping to come up with some concrete action items which we can take forward into maybe a further conference, but for sure a further action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philippe, and thank you, Ayaki. Thank you for your words of welcome and for hosting us and working with us for the last couple of months, really, to get this off the ground. But it's absolutely worth it because this is a defining issue, not just in itself, but in the nature of it. And I'll come on to that later on. Very briefly, for those of you who don't know who GISF are, we are an independent network. We are owned and guided and governed by our NGO members, of whom there are over 140 humanitarian, development, human rights of all sizes, all committed to keeping their own aid workers safe. We act as a critical mass of NGOs, providing a platform for them to come together and to find these solutions to issues which affect all of them, and through which the wider community of donors, member states, commercial actors, and UN agencies can collaborate with NGO practitioners on the ground. At its heart, GISF exists because no organisation could face these challenges alone. It is only by working together across our NGOs, across national NGOs, and with our partners that we can protect staff and sustain humanitarian access, because at the end of the day, safety and security is largely about getting our staff where they need to be to do the work that they need to do, and that they can come home again afterwards. So this is the spirit in which we meet at a time when risks to aid workers are at an all-time high and when collective action is more urgent than ever. Regarding drones, I would frame drones as the thin end of the wedge, that between shifts to the rules-based order, digital threats, AI, future autonomous weapon systems, change is going to come at us at a much faster rate than at any time in recent history. With drones really being the first of those waves to crash over us, I hold in equal importance two things for today and for what's going to carry on after today. So both our ability to manage the new risk, the new risk dimension that drones are introducing, but also how we identify those solutions to that risk. So each of these AI, autonomous weapons systems, digital threats, cyber attacks, each of them in isolation could upend current approaches to aid work. They are catalysts to a wholesale change of our system. And so we being NGOs, UN, the commercial sector, member states, think tanks, we need to respond as a system. So starting from today and over the coming months and years, yes, I do want to find solutions to today's topic, to how to mitigate the threat of drones. But I also want us as a collective, as a system, to generate some muscle memory for how we can be agile, humble, collaborative, and innovative in meeting these new threats that are going to be coming in the future. And that is why today's discussions are structured the way that they are. We begin this morning with a briefing session grounding ourselves in the evidence and the frontline realities of how drones are already shaping humanitarian operations and access. After the break, we will move into a session on security risk management, examining how organizations can adapt in practice and have adapted in practice, what tools and measures are already available and where the gaps remain. And finally, this afternoon, many of you will join the session on diplomatic engagement and collective advocacy, considering how states, donors, and multilateral bodies can help close the normative and policy gaps. Kindly note that this afternoon's session is closed door with limited remote participation, and that is not to be exclusive. It's just to try and allow for some outside the box thinking. Very briefly, somebody had to have a go at defining drones for this session, and that's fallen to me, unfortunately. And let me use this moment to encourage you to actively participate online and in the room. This is a brainstorming. I think Philippe said we need to do some brainstorming. We need to throw in some different perspectives. So you can start immediately, if you want, by arguing with my definition of drones. Generally, what we're looking at is unmanned aircraft systems at one end of the spectrum. And these are your long range, medium range. They're typically produced and operated by recognized militaries. And as I say, they're referred to as unmanned aircraft systems. Drones itself is a term that's predominantly used in the civilian domain and been picked up by the aid sector. And from NATO's perspective, certainly what that's looking at is the more FPV, dual purpose technology type of drone, the short range drones, which can be used by tactical units as well. Commercially available, essentially. We'll be getting into a bit more of the definitions. I think Christina may touch on those as well. But for now, let me say that we do, and we will come into this definitely, there are different mitigations that go with each in terms of the long range, militarized military technology and the dual purpose technology. They each have their own unique requirements for mitigation. So on that note, I thank you again for being here. I look forward to a day of meaningful discussion. Thank you very much to my colleagues up here for introducing the session, and we'll do a quick changeover and I'll invite Christina to start making her way up. So thank you very much. You can take a seat up there.
More naturally, the camera angle is like.
I don't want to risk it.
Okay. And how?
Excellent. All right, and right, let's leap straight in. To recap, this session one will be a scene setting session, looking at some of the data that exists, some of the legal frameworks that exist, but also importantly, as mentioned by my colleagues at the beginning, what some of the human elements are in terms of what it is like to work in a context where there's a proliferation of drone usage. So we will look to go beyond drones are a problem. How and why are they a problem? So to begin, I would like to invite Christina to set the scene. She, as the Director of Insecurity Insight, who have conducted some very, very foundational research on the impact of drones on the aid sector. Insecurity Insights was founded by Christina in 2008. She specializes in monitoring open sources and social media to track incidents affecting aid security and pioneered the concept of the Security Incident Information Management. Her work includes highlighting the impact of explosive weapons on essential civilian services and humanitarian access, and is certainly my go-to for impacts on frontline health services. So, Christina, over to you.
Thank you, John, for this nice introduction. And I think thank you to everyone who's here in the room, because this is an extremely important subject. And in my view, it is really three things why this matters so much and is so important that we're here together. First, the issue is rising. And I've put one graph up there that just shows that in 2019, it basically did not happen that aid was directly affected. It started in high numbers in 23, it skyrocketed in 24, and 25, we are seeing this continuing trend. The other reason behind the rising numbers is that the use of drone impacts aid operations in very specific ways. And this is what we need to understand here in order to find the right mitigations. And I put a picture up there that gives one image of how it can happen. They can be used in what is called a double tap strike. So you might have an airstrike, you then get first responders who come in to pick up the injured, to take them into medical care, and then the drone comes and attacks the first responders. So that's an illustration of how this technology can be strategically used to directly interfere with aid. And that's something we need to take into account when thinking about the strategies. And if you move to the next slide, it also highlights some of the other issues that have already been clearly stated here. It is a duty of care issue. Too many aid workers have been killed, and this data already feels horribly out of date because it ends at the end of the last calendar year. But it is also more than that. It is also an issue of protection of civilians. And that is because of the nature of how our aid systems are currently changing. More and more local volunteers are doing the frontline work. It is the local partners of NGOs, of UN agencies that do the frontline work. And these organizations do not have the ultimate security risk management strategy that is open to ICRC, MSF, or anyone else. That is to say, it's no longer safe, we stop operations. If you are the local responder, you are within that community and you stay in that community. And that means if you want to have effective security risk management for the local partners who are doing the frontline aid in conflict zones, we need to think of how can we link that to the protection of civilians. And I think in the great introduction we already had from WFP and UNHCR, the other aspects were already mentioned. It is a question of access. It is a question of humanitarian diplomacy. It is high-level advocacy. So we're facing a very complex issue here. So in order to sort of really get us into the subject, I want you, I'd like to share with you the answer to a question that I believe we all need to ask first and foremost these days where disinformation is so widely spread. How do you know what you think you know? How sure can you be that what you tell us is actually true? And you can move to the next slide. So bear with me just a few words of where does this information come from that I will be sharing with you in a minute. So as Insecurity Insight, we use an event-based monitoring of incidents where aid is directly affected. So we're not monitoring conflict, we're monitoring the events where the principle of distinction was not applied because aid or central civilian infrastructure was somehow affected. When we started this work, this was in 2008, helping the ICRC to develop what later became its Healthcare in Danger initiative. We used as part of the open source process, literally the newspapers from affected countries. Since then, the information environment has fundamentally changed. So much information has moved online, and that is how we adapted over time. So today we are using an AI-supported monitoring system that has been trained with the help of people from CERN and some pro bono work from AI companies to use algorithms that function like a huge magnet that pulls out of all the information that's out there what we trained it to consider relevant because it affected aid or vital civilian services. And that information is processed through some sort of platform, and then we have the humans going through it and looking at it and trying to make sense of it, checking its trustability and verifying as much as possible. And it goes in a database, and at that point, we're also working with aid agencies on the ground, verifying, checking, and that then becomes the basis of our report. I'm very happy to answer sort of any questions, but that's sort of the overall process. So now we have had a project from the European Commission that was set up to monitor the impact of explosive weapons on civilians and vital civilian services as part of the monitoring of the implementation of the political declaration of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And as part of this work, we went through a system of classifying everything we found by different types of explosive weapons. And that really was the origin for discovering what is happening with drones. And you can move to the next slide. And this is now the sort of other technical bit I'm sharing with you here, which is a little bit of how do we need to think about drones? And John has already said, you know, there's all sorts of different definitions. The way I approach it, because we are at its basis a research organization that tries to make sense of information, we think of it not as a weapon, but as a delivery platform. And that means it is equivalent in our assessment of what it means, what it does, compared to a plane or a ground-based rocket launcher or a suicide vest or a car bomb. It is a vehicle in which to deliver an explosive device that can cause harm. And that is a way of how we're looking at it. So what are these delivery platforms? Now, in terms of what the drones are, they clearly are an air-delivered platform, and they are then many, many different ways. And I think this is something we'll get to many times throughout the day. They can be big, they can be small, they can carry big explosive, they can carry small explosive, they can be single purpose dropping a bomb, they can be surveillance, and then when the battery is low dropping a bomb, they can come as individual, they can come as a flock, where they work like insects, one supporting the others through protection or surveillance or something. So they can be remotely controlled, they can be AI programmed, there are many, many different things. And that's also something that is extremely complex because different contexts use different weapons, and they can be used in different ways affecting aid. So while we use this catch-all term, I think the moment we're thinking about practical mitigation, it gets very complicated and technical. So with that, I like to share with you a few sort of findings from the data analysis we did to sort of set the scene of how I think we need to think about this. And you can move to the sort of next slide. I've already said it was something we saw in 23 emerging, but one other factor we saw was that at first, it were the health services that were heavily impacted, and it was relatively rare for aid to be directly affected. In 24, this has changed in the sense that it continued to affect healthcare in very high numbers, but the aid attacks were added to it, and in 25, we're seeing this continuing. And that, to me, is another important point that I think we should carry throughout the day. The aid program matters. Aid isn't just aid. There are different activities, food distribution, healthcare protection. All of these things are different and therefore exposed to different risks. And that's what we need to factor in when we think about it. And you can move to the next slide. The other key thing we noticed was how it's geographically spreading. The first use we saw in Syria, we later saw quite a few, maybe trial users in Ethiopia. It is clearly something that's on everyone's mind for Ukraine, in Gaza, but it also happens across Africa, Myanmar to a large extent. So it affects many countries, and I think it is growing. And that also means in each context, it's also different, and that affects how we need to sort of think about it. And the next slide shows us another important factor. The users of explosive weapons affecting aid are predominantly states. And this is now, again, important to think what this data is. This is not data on who uses states in conflict. This is the data of when does the use of drone-delivered explosives affect aid. And this is driven by states. And that was quite an interesting finding, because originally in the sort of emerging literature on drones, there was this assumption it will be something for the non-state actors. But what we're really seeing, it is the states driving the threat for the aid sector. And clearly drones are also being used in criminal cartels and many other aspects. But again, I think we need to think where is the distinction for aid and general drone use. But again, this is 24 data. Maybe 25 will look a little bit different because we've also have Haiti, for example. So that's the other thing. Everything is constantly changing and we need to keep sort of looking at it. So what to do about it? And I think this is the key thing why we're here, to really think what can be the practical things. So you can move to the next slide. Here is some sort of findings within the data that I think points us to some key things that are very, very practical. So we need to ask, when are the aid workers affected? Is it when they're in vehicles moving, or is it when they're in fixed structures running their programs? And this again seems to sort of vary a little bit of what aid programs you do, and also what organization you are. If you're mainly bringing in supplies, it is really how to secure your vehicles, your transport. If you are the local frontline implementing organizations, then it becomes more the risk at the moment of the delivery of aid, whether that's the healthcare or the distribution of food. So it's really not a fit-all approach to this. We need to think, what's the moment and how is this linked to the particular activity and objective that's being at risk here. And if you move to the next slide, this also sort of shows an overview. Again, this is only 23 and 24 data. What kind of programs seem to be most affected? Very heavily healthcare, but also protection and food were the areas that really came out. And I think that's sort of no coincidence that WFP and UNHCR are leading on this, because these are sort of some of the particular sectors that are very heavily affected. So the next slide, none of this development is isolated from wider narratives and discussions. And one of the key things to also think about is how the context on social media drives sort of narratives around it, because very often we find that when drones are used against aid operations, it comes together with a narrative that defines those providing aid as linked to terrorists, or also increasingly as supposedly doing acts harmful to the enemy. So there is also a very strong framing happening in parallel, and that's also something to be aware of. And so to sort of conclude, I think it is really great, the focus of the event today. You can move to the next sort of slide. We'll be looking at security risk management. And maybe someone would ask, why do we need to do this? Security risk management has been there, there's all these manuals. It is important to look at it because the nature of these weapon systems call into question many of the practices that we're used to. And just one example, I was sent a document from my Swiss commune of what to do in an emergency, and this was telling us the place where we should all assemble and wait for the authorities to get further instructions. And I think we're all used to this, right? This is what you get on boats. This is what you do during a fire drill. Well, if you are under a drone threat, that's the worst thing you can do, because that means loads of people can be killed in one moment. So what you need to do is the opposite. Disperse as widely as possibly, as quickly as possible, zigzagging away. So I'm just putting this out there because I think the changing nature of the threat means we need to unlearn what we may have thought for decades is the right approach. And that applies to so many different levels of security risk management that I think it is essential that a very thorough review is carried out of what is the right advice in the right context in relation to the right program and the right organization that's affected. And then the final point is also, as people have already said, it is also a question of a wider advocacy framing around the protection of the whole aid system. And the key for that is the international humanitarian law. And the question is, how can we bring this into the overall connection to our security risk management? Because aid security risk management is not a securing, it is an approach that is access focused, it's acceptance based. And that's the challenge we're seeing at the moment that's affecting, in particular, the local partners who are working on the ground, because there is such an onslaught, including via the social media platforms, on discrediting what they are doing. And deliberately, systematically undermining the reason for their protection. And that's why I think if we want to have a good, or if the good security risk approach that is equitable from the UN agency to the INGOs to the local partners, we need to think beyond the box and how we've done things until now. Extremely challenging, but I thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to the discussions, and I hope that collectively we might come up with some good ideas of how to tackle this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. If you have any questions, we will have a time at the end, so take a note and you'll have that opportunity. I'm now going to invite Luke Irving. Is Luke online? Fantastic. Luke joined UNMAS in January 2025, bringing 17 years of experience to that role. Luke previously undertook service as a combat engineer in the British Army, and after leaving the military in 2014, Luke worked in the humanitarian and development sector, predominantly in Africa and the Middle East, specialising in humanitarian mine action, civil military coordination, programming and operations. Between 2015 and 2018, Luke worked closely with the White Helmets in Syria, and he has very graciously agreed to join us and give us a perspective of what it is like to be a humanitarian practitioner at the moment in a context affected by drones. So thank you, Luke.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Christina, for the warm-up. I hope you can all hear me okay. There's a slight reach back coming back, so maybe I don't know if the room can mute. Thanks, and good to meet everyone. Good morning. I'll just start by firstly just where I could bring sort of context to everything that's been said. I'm currently the Chief of Mine Action Program for Palestine. So I work heavily in the West Bank and Gaza. I was recently in Gaza about a few weeks ago. I'm currently outside on a bit of a R&R, but happy to do this call now because I think this is very, very important. Before then, I was working with WFP in Ukraine, and as previously mentioned, was also in working on Syria with the White Helmets as they were held in opposition-held areas before the current change of government last year. Also, before then, you know, as mentioned, I was in the military and worked quite a lot with sort of early days of drones in the sort of war and terror days in Afghanistan as a soldier. So I say all this because I think it's a useful trend I've noticed and seen and experienced personally going through and how drones have matured. And, you know, I think it's widely been discussed. They are front and center of warfare now. They're not something conceptually on the side. They dominate the wars I've recently been exposed to, the current one in Gaza and certainly when I was in Ukraine. I think there's loads of factors from a security management perspective, how this impacts aid workers. And I will share that experience with just many considerations, which again, I think will add to this conversation. And again, happy to take questions perhaps at the end of the session, because I know a lot of people are quite interested in what's going on in Palestine and stuff. You know, I'll see what I can answer and hopefully share experience, but I want to keep this focused on the humanitarian security management. What I firstly described is maybe, you know, I'll draw my experience in Ukraine, and I was in the East Ukraine with World Food Program in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city. And just that was a city that was 40 minutes from the Russian border, so it had a lot of ordnance thrown at it on almost a daily basis. So you'd have to go to shelters, you have to take necessary action, or you didn't react at all, and that was by choice. But just being present there, trying to do my job, you know, one of the issues I would highlight is the sort of sleep deprivation that you could potentially describe, because these one-way attack drone showers, you've probably heard of them in the news. They were coming over on a sort of nightly basis, and they have the earlier models had a sort of like a lawnmower sounding engine, and that would you know, be quite loud, and you could hear that buzz go through, and then also when it goes into its dive trajectory to hit its target, that noise becomes a bit like becomes very loud and prominent and quite disconcerting because they have a large explosive warhead and they're quite deadly if you're near one when they go off. So just simply functioning an aid worker in the sort of modern war context, and particularly how we're seeing this sort of merger of aid being implemented at the same time as conflict taking place, which is the case of Ukraine, and certainly the case in Gaza. I think it's very interesting to draw on. Current experience in Gaza, drones are used mainly, larger drones, I should say. Actually, there's a whole proliferation of them which we come across, but the main ones are sort of larger drones. The Air Force operated ones that can drop lethal munitions, but are predominantly used for surveillance. You can hear them; they're very dominant, and it's an uncontested airspace because there isn't anti-aircraft, etc. So these drones come quite low, and they are very, very loud. And again, they're used in the middle of the night for military means, and they can keep you up. So I think just generally humanitarians operating in the current conflict dynamics is quite taxing. It's a challenging place to be. Other things I want to sort of draw on, I talked a lot about aviation, which I think is the main predominating issue at the moment, but what we're also seeing in Gaza and increasingly also in Ukraine, but it's much more on the front line, so aid workers aren't exposed. But in Gaza, there are use of large ground-based drones, ground-based vehicles, which are repurposed armored personnel vehicle carriers, and they are filled with explosives and driven into a particular urban setting. Again, in the conflict area, most people should have hopefully evacuated, and they're very, very devastating and indiscriminate. So that's the type of nature of the drones, I thought would be useful to share with all of you online. I think with the last on Christina's comments, we've mentioned IHL. I think that's really, really critical. And where this is getting quite blurred and maybe perhaps coming to the fore is what you're seeing with the proliferation of drones is you're seeing drones being used, I think, by lower tactical units. Whereas before, we still have it, larger drones are perhaps used by the Air Force, and if the ground forces want to use it, they go through their brigade commander to the Air Force, deconfliction, senior officers are involved in the targeting systems, etc., to utilize kinetic activity to conduct lethal activity. What you're seeing is the proliferation of maybe one-way attack drones, FPVs, again, well documented, or even smaller drones at a company level or platoon level of soldiers, junior officer in charge of them or senior NCOs, and they depending on their rules of engagement utilize these systems. And I think this is where the lines get blurred a bit, because you have basically a lot of lethal firepower now in the hands of lower level troops. Command and decision making has been decentralized. The implications for aid workers is perhaps the recognition and the deconfliction notification systems taking place to warn those military units or make them aware of those military units of who's in the area is becoming harder to do, or it hasn't taken place in the way it should have done. Perhaps those units haven't had sufficient training on IHL and law of armed conflict, and get confused of what's an acceptable target and what's not. And ultimately drones are just a vehicle, just a tool in the military toolbox. These are the sort of implementation and operational issues which I think are, for me, the highest concern. Drones are here to stay. They're going to become more proliferated. I think that's well discussed, and certainly will be discussed further over the course of today. So I do want to, maybe that's something I've experienced, is all lower level units, potentially not with a great understanding of IHL, haven't had sufficient training, have very, very deadly kinetic weapons, and get the drones given that reach, and they can drop, ordnance from these things, or they could be loitering munitions or kamikaze drone type munitions, and it's very deadly. On the other hand, on the reverse of that, drones provide a very, very useful ISR elements of the military, target acquisition, information space on a live feed, etc. And that could be beneficial to humanitarians in the sense military units are more aware and they see where you are on the battlefield and stuff like that. And I'd hope that would be the case. I can't speak again. I'm not sitting in these areas, obviously, when these decisions are made. But that provides a helpful tool for military commanders to decipher where the civilians are, population, and humanitarians. And so when you, again, I think not a learning point in the vehicle, the marking of vehicles, how that is communicated to militaries, what the vehicles look like, it's really, really, really important. And in Gaza, at some point it was discussed if vehicles would have particular sort of infrared flashes on them. So at night they could be clearly identified. That was coming through people involved with civil military liaison. And that comes to my final point, probably the most important as humanitarians, is the real. It's always been a thing, but I think it's the case for it's as strong as ever. I used to do this in my previous work before joining UNMAS, is civil military liaison, and the need for humanitarian organizations, the UN, to have these trained individuals part of their apparatus. Some of them might come under access, some of them might come under security, it doesn't really matter. But you do need to have that technically trained civil military liaison officers to be there, to work out all these systems, to educate the military on what you're up to, what they're doing, etc., and then reverse that knowledge back to the humanitarian space to bring out what's going on and what the militaries are up to and what their concerns and constraints are. But also, a civil officer, particularly if they're ex-military, doesn't have to be, or they've done their research and stuff, can also educate the humanitarian service they're working for about these weapon systems, what's going on, how they operate, the command and control structures, etc., what they can glean out of that. And it's a role that I felt potentially was underestimated when I was doing it myself by humanitarian leadership, and not through, being flippant about it or anything. It's just, it's a very niche trade that maybe there's a lack of understanding for, but I think off the back of Ukraine, still happening in Ukraine, and certainly in Palestine now, your civil military officers, and they can be working for ING as well, it's not just the UN, are really, really important, because you just need to have that layer of communication and notification. And your notification mechanisms are just so important to make sure it is all both static and movement sites. So I think I'll leave it there. I hope I've given some useful insights from the field. I'm happy to elaborate further within reason in the Q&A, and I'll pass it back to the panel. And thanks again, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Luke. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to bring up a video from some national NGO employees working out of Myanmar. And I think that this video, a few minutes long, reflects the harsh realities of healthcare owing to the recent attacks that have been taking place against them. So, Alyssa, are you able to pull that up, please?
We are Jamai when you turn out the Alka, Tamlumune, you do see on your town, Dr. Zoana, the Mune, Jamai town, and in it, and when you saw any at the back. Tore Mapsite, Piro, we are the Laja, but not general net and we the mute area, the Laja to be seated. Kai Kaya Muchonga, General Chikai Garo, Luna Zao, Alum Bombono, okay, Jessie Garo. ကျွန်တော်တို့လူနာဆောင်နေမျက်စိသွားတယ်လူနာဆောင်အလုံးပေါင်း၄ဆောင်မျက်စိသွားတယ်ပြီးတော့ခွဲစိတ်ခံနဲ့တွဲရက်ပေါ့နော်ခွဲစိတ်ခံနဲ့တွဲရက်ဓာတ်မှန်ကန်နဲ့ဒီ ultrasound လို့ခေါ်တဲ့ ultrasound ကန်ပေါ့နော်အဲ့ဒီခံအဓိကမျက်စိသွားပါတယ်ဗျတို့ရဲ့ဒီနေမှာရှိတဲ့ဆက်သွယ်ရေးစနစ်ကိုလည်းသူတို့ကကျွန်တော်တို့မှာ iPhone တွေရှိတယ်ဗျာအဲ့မှာလင်းပြန်အားရောက်နေပြီပြောတဲ့စနစ်ကိုသူတို့ကခွေးရ line တူးပြီးတော့အောက်ရှက်နေဆက်ရဘုံဖို့ခြင်းနဲ့ပုံချတာပေါ့ဗျာ ပထမတစ်လုံးကျဲသွားတာပေါ့ကျဲသွားပြီးတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ဘုံကိုညနေကိုကိုစီရောက်ကြပြီပထမအချက်မှာတော့ဘယ်လိုထိလဲမထိလဲကျွန်တော်တို့တေချာမသိနိုင်ဘူးပေါ့နော်အဲ့ဒီချိန်မှာပဲလေရင်ကနောက်ထပ်2ပတ်လောက်တစ်ပတ်ဒုတိယတစ်ပတ်ပြန်ဝဲတယ်ဝဲပြီးတော့ဒုတိယတစ်ပတ်မှာမကျဲသွားဘူးပြီးတော့တတိယတစ်ပတ်ပြန်ဝဲပြီးတော့မှနောက်တစ်လုံးကျဲသွားတာပေါ့နော်10မှာတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ပြန်ပြီးတော့စိတ်ရောကိုယ်ရောပြန်ပြီးတော့ဒီနေအောင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကြိုးစားရအောင်ပါပေါ့လေဒီနေနေမှာရှိတဲ့ပြည်သူတွေကိုလည်းကျွန်တော်တို့ကဟိုမျက်နှာလွဲကဲပြစ်ထားလို့မရဘူးဆိုတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကဆက်ပြီးတော့တမိုင်းဆော့ရှော့မှုတော့ပေးနေရမှာပဲပေါ့ဒါကျွန်တော်တို့စေယုံပျက်စီးသွားတယ်စေယုံရှိတော့ဘူးဆိုပေမဲ့ကျွန်တော်တို့တွေတက်ရှိနေသေးတာပဲလေနော်ကြတော့
A sobering perspective there. Next to bring a conclusion to this session before we move to questions is Sarah Ground-Clement, who is a researcher at UNHCR. She works across the conventional arms and ammunition and security and technology programs. Her expertise spans international security, counterterrorism, and emerging technologies with a focus on horizon scanning and future scenarios. Prior to joining UNHCR, Sarah was a senior analyst at RAND Europe. So Sarah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I hope you can hear me okay in the room and online. I assume that you are, so yeah, just thank you again for inviting me, and apologies that I'm not actually with you in person today. After the very interesting and eye-opening presentations by the other speakers, I'll be providing a slightly different angle, which is that of the arms control perspective. And I'll cover 3 main issues in my presentation. So the first, I'm going to explain why there is such an appeal to the use of UASs, so uncrewed aerial systems. So basically, why are militaries using these systems, and why are we seeing such an increase in use? Second, I will explain the kind of existing arms control mechanisms which are in place, which aim to both improve the transparency about the systems in existence and regulate their transfers. And thirdly, I'll discuss the gaps and limitations with regards to these mechanisms, and then areas for actions that could be explored to overcome these. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Of course, uncrewed aerial systems are not new, but their use has grown, as we've heard already today, and especially so in the last 2 decades or so. And there are several different aspects to the appeal of these systems, and I'll touch on a few of them. So the first is that these systems offer affordable force projection. So I'll kind of break this down a bit. By affordable, we've heard that there's different types of systems. So of course, some systems are much more affordable than others, and others are much more expensive, depending on what type of system we're talking about. It's very hard to provide blanket statements because, as John and Christina rightly mentioned, there are different types of systems with different payloads. But nonetheless, they are more affordable. There is a relative affordability compared to crewed platforms. So this means that a greater number of these platforms can be purchased versus their crewed equivalents. And this provides either complementary or additional air power to states, or enables them to have air power in the first place. And as I mentioned, costs differ. So some systems will be more expensive. They will offer a greater range of capabilities. Some are less sophisticated and are much cheaper, or even are what we call commercial off-the-shelf costs. And coming back to kind of the force projection, some types of UASs, so high-end stealthy models, but also smaller, less high-end models, especially when used, a great many are used together, can also help evade or sometimes avoid detection and interception by counter-UAS technology. So that also lends another appeal to them. And indeed, I think there's a particular kind of cost benefit to this, and that often the kind of technologies that are used to counter UASs, such as missiles, are much more expensive than the UASs themselves. So, you're kind of providing a lot of force projection, and the person defending has to kind of provide more costly countermeasures. So secondly, UASs are simply another tool in the toolbox enabling increasingly remote warfare. This enables reduced risk to the life of military personnel. But of course, here again, it comes down to what types of systems are we talking about. Some of the lower end systems may not have a great range of use or may be limited. We mentioned fiber optic cables earlier. These are tethered, so they, there is a kind of physical limitation to how far they can be used. So to some extent, personnel, depending on what systems they use, can be still exposed to risks from other UASs, missiles, loitering munitions, etc. But more generally, the bottom line is that these do enable greater remote warfare and kind of have this more kind of security to the life of military personnel. They can also be used in missions which were perhaps previously considered too risky, or missions that are more persistent, and especially in missions where the life of military personnel do not need to be considered in the same way. So there is also a change in the way that they are being used and the kind of missions that they can be used for. There is also the argument that UASs increase the precision of military action. I think this is a bit of a challenging point because in practice, we are still seeing civilians and other actors being harmed, especially because of the fact that conflicts are increasingly taking place in or near populated areas. So this is a bit of a more nuanced argument than just a straightforward one. I know this is something we're going to come back to, but just to mention that precision will also depend on the type of systems and also the way that these systems are being impacted by countermeasures. So lower end systems may not have technology which is good enough to ensure precision, but also if systems are jammed, hacked, or otherwise, they may lose kind of the precision aspect. And generally also, we talk about UASs systems, but also the payload may just not be precise. And finally, and Luke touched upon this, these systems are very versatile. So of course, they can be armed, they can conduct strike operations, but they can also be used for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR, but also other tasks such as logistic support. And so in that sense, they're not just a piece of military equipment for lethal action. They have a much broader range of application areas, which can also be used by other actors, including humanitarian aid actors, as Luke mentioned. But if we go to the next slide, and coming back to military uncrewed aerial systems, I want to demonstrate a bit more concretely what this interest in UAS means in practice for military capabilities. Yeah, I'm still seeing my previous slide. Okay, perfect. I think there may be a lag. So there's a growing number of states which possess UASs, and this also includes armed systems. And I'm going to look at this through three different dimensions. First, we have the acquisition of UASs. So this means a state generally acquiring from another state. And as you can see on the slide, there's a big jump in acquisitions. This has been spurred by, seeing these systems in action, but also improvements to the technology and so on, the appeal factors that I mentioned earlier. And we've seen kind of also an evolution in the system. So before, kind of earlier models were mainly fixed wing, high-end systems, and we saw a trend towards an increase in rotary wing systems. And now, of course, we have a plethora of also commercial systems. FPVs have been mentioned, for example. According to a report, as of 2024, over 110 states were recorded owning military UASs. This includes both armed and unarmed systems. And going to the second dimension, which is that of national production, here again, we see the same trend where we've witnessed an increase of states producing or developing these systems. So no longer just relying on others to acquire systems. So really developing national capabilities. And the third dimension is use. And indeed, it's been mentioned, but these systems have been increasingly used. The uses have changed. We moved from strikes during counterterrorism operations, and now it's really expanded to a plethora of uses, a range of uses, in both lethal and non-lethal. And of course, I focus on states, kind of trends, but it's important to note that all of these, the acquisition, the development, and the use are also, and the growth of these trends are also something that we're seeing in non-state actors. But in this presentation, I'm going to focus on states, but I just wanted to mention this element. So moving to the next slide. With this background in mind, I now want to turn to explaining what are the existing arms control mechanisms and frameworks pertaining to uncrewed aerial systems. Just as a point of reference, I've included two Security Council resolutions aimed at non-state actors. These are just there to complete the slide. I won't touch them, but just there for your benefit. But I'm going to focus on the ones aimed at states. So the first one is the UN Register of Conventional Arms. This is a voluntary transparency mechanisms that is a reporting mechanism where all member states of the UN can report on their international transfers of conventional arms, which include UASs. They call it in the mechanism unmanned combat aerial vehicles, but it is voluntary in nature. And if you look at kind of reporting numbers of previous years, you'll note that only a portion, maybe 30, 40 states provide inputs every year. Yet this is a really important mechanism because it helps provide transparency and helps build confidence between member states on capabilities and thus reduce the possibility of an arms race. The second is the Arms Trade Treaty. This currently has 115 states parties. It establishes common standards and regulates the international trade of conventional weapons, of which UASs, and it also includes a reporting requirement for states to report on their exports yearly. And then we have two others. So the Missile Technology Control Regime, MTCR. This is equally voluntary. It has 35 member states, and the aim is to prevent proliferation of what they call unmanned delivery systems capable of delivering weapons of mass destruction. And then we have the Wassenaar Arrangement, again voluntary. It has 42 participating states, and it aims to improve greater transparency on transfers of conventional arms and dual-use goods and technologies. And beyond these arms control mechanisms, their use of UAS is regulated under several legal regimes, including IHL, so International Humanitarian Law, and IHRL, International Human Rights Law. And so from a legal perspective, the rules that are applicable to UASs do not differ to those applicable to other military platforms or, in a context of a military operation. So as you can see, the transfer and the use of UASs does not take place in a vacuum. But despite this, there are gaps and limitations, and I'll turn to those in the next slide. So you've probably noticed from how I was describing these mechanisms that they vary very much in their scope and how they define uncrewed aerial systems and their degree of relevance to armed UASs, and also in their participation rates. So the UN ROCA is really the only one that englobes all UN member states, but it's voluntary, and as I mentioned, submissions are perhaps lower than we would like. And the rest also have varying levels of participation. Secondly, I think it's important to note that the Arms Trade Treaty is the only mechanism which makes a link between transfer, so an export of a system, and its use. And it makes this link explicitly as part of states parties' obligations. So making sure that use is within falls within IHL. So like there's risk assessments to the transfers and so on. But that is the only one which explicitly links those two parts in the life cycle of the system. And indeed, kind of previously, there was a focus mainly on capabilities of UASs, but now we are slowly seeing a shift to more a behavior-based approach, so enforcing more responsible use of these systems. But the existing mechanisms, apart from the ATT, don't really make that explicit link. And it's still very much a pervasive approach to examining systems based on their capabilities as opposed to based on their use. Thirdly, I noted that there was a growth in the national production of UASs when I talked about the trends. However, and you may have noticed this, the existing mechanisms are predicated upon international transfers. So in other words, we are not collecting data. We don't have sufficient information about what states are producing nationally, and there's no regulation of or data on national production. And finally, I mentioned the great range of UASs and the increased use of commercial systems. This is a trend that is not necessarily captured either in the arms control mechanisms. We do have the Wassenaar arrangement. It does aim to capture dual-use goods and dual-use parts and components, as long as they meet a certain threshold. But that aspect is not adequately reflected in other existing mechanisms. So I don't want to leave us on a negative note. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to outline some areas for action which can help strengthen the arms control frameworks and mechanisms. So first, there is a need to improve transparency and accountability to, on both the acquisition, but also kind of the national production. So basically, that's like the holdings, what member states currently own in terms of armed UASs or even USs more generally and their components. I'm going to take those two parts in turn, the transparency and the accountability. On transparency, it would be very beneficial to have more information on national production along with kind of import and export data. And there is already a push in this direction by the group of governmental experts on the continuing operation of the UN Register of Conventional Arms, suggesting a change of language, so it's no longer inviting states to provide information about national production, but requesting. So hopefully this will go through. It's been proposed, but there is a move towards influencing that. But also, states are also welcome to provide this data in their yearly reports. Kind of going back to more the accountability part, this is really stressing the ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty, as a key treaty for the arms trade. So really continuing efforts to encourage membership, encourage better reporting, stricter adherence to the treaty, because as I mentioned, it's really a core one in terms of linking exports and use of systems. Secondly, another element is improving counter-diversion efforts. That means kind of trying to avoid items kind of being sent or being shared to people who are not, so like the wrong end users, we call them the wrong end users, or for wrong end uses. And this can, there are already measures in place, but we can also improve on what exists. There can be better cooperation between states and the private and commercial sectors, so working more closely together, better information sharing, but also exploring other innovative approaches, such as the use of technologies to counter diversion. Third, there is a need to improve compliance with international law. I think we've, already touched upon this. It's kind of, you can't disaggregate development, export, and use. So this is a key component. Increased dialogue about the use of these systems between member states, further exchanges on how we can protect to preserve humanity and this type of warfare could be beneficial. And finally, I work in policy research, so it's very important to acknowledge that policies should be grounded in accurate data and accurate knowledge, and improving the data and knowledge that we have about armed UAS use is really important. And you can see how this links back to my first point on how we lack data on national production. But just generally, it also helps with making evidence-based mitigation and prevention strategies kind of based on what we understand is happening in the world. So moving to the conclusion, which is also the next slide. The development and use of UASs has grown, and this trend is set to continue. There are mechanisms in place that pertain to UASs and seek to control these systems, there are nonetheless gaps and limitations, and actions are available and also needed to address these gaps and limitations, which states and other actors can also look to put in place. You can find further research and information about the work we do on uncrewed systems across different domains in the QR code. But thank you so much for your attention and look forward to any questions. Back over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Just before we move into questions, everyone hadn't quite finished joining online while we were doing the welcoming, but now that we have settled in, I'd just like to take a moment to thank and acknowledge some of the member states who have joined us in person. We've got the United Kingdom, Portugal, Norway, Canada, as well as NATO, and appreciate you coming. And online, we're joined by Ireland, Poland, Sweden, Austria, some more friends from the United Kingdom, as well as ECHO. We've also got 44 more people online who are actively listening and engaging, hopefully. So thank you very much to all of you for taking the time to join us. Do we have any questions in the room? I have a number of questions which I'm looking forward to asking, but I thought I'd throw it open to anybody in the room first. And you just need to raise your hand. Thank you, Philippe.
Thanks very much, John. It's a question at the same time also a comment. And I liked what Luke was telling us about the difference in command and control between the smaller, I would say, first-person view drones and the larger ones. And in addition, I would like to add the easiness of procuring such first-person view drones would prompt me, and maybe you also you, to try to prioritize actions, risk management actions against the use of these ones. And for a whole bunch of reasons, of course, one of them, of course, was the command and control, lower level military personnel without proper knowledge about the entire system are using them as a training ground also, and then also the easiness to acquire these makes them, I think, a larger risk for our worldwide operations. Thank you.
Would you want to build on that, Kim?
Yes, my question was a little bit related, actually. So, thanks.
Really, did you want to introduce yourself as well?
My name's Kim Squibber. I'm from the H2H network. What really came through for me is that the primary user of these technologies are states, both from Christina's presentation and from the examples that we had. But it does seem that there's two technology tracks for these drones. So both those sort of traditional R&D and military acquisition procurement lines, but also these more sort of rotor-based, locally produced drones. And so is it true that there's a correlation between those and the lower level of command use? And can we also, does the data show at all which of those tracks is leading to the most impacts on aid workers, or are we not able to draw that out? Because presumably the smaller drones also usually carry smaller payloads, and so perhaps the risks might be different there. So I wondered if we knew that, and also in terms of how we might respond and increase the protection of aid workers, if there's different strategies that we want to take for the two technology tracks. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Christina, did you want to start on whether you've got any disaggregation between the two types? And then we'll pass to Luke, if you would like to respond to that.
No, thanks for this really useful question. And unfortunately, this is extremely difficult information to have, because on our end, we're getting the information from the affected communities. And to get that information, they would need to have a very high level of technical knowledge to be able to actually report what was used. So the very simple answer is no. There is very little information, and I think it's a problem. We are currently trying to work on sort of very basic training material for some of our partners in Myanmar, for example, to tell them what sort of images to possibly take with their phones and how they could then be shared with some experts who may be able just from bits and pieces to draw some of these conclusions. But that requires quite an elaborate process of safely telling people how safely to approach debris, what pictures to take, and how to pass these pictures on in a way that's actually safe. So I'd say we're at the beginning of such a process, but I agree, this is data we really need, but it's hard to get.
Thank you. And Luke, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, thank you. I think I captured the question along the lines of what's feasible in the field and where humanitarians could play a role. I mean, firstly, I'll mention experience in Syria. The White Helmets had GoPros. This is for 2015, 16, 17 in Syria, and effectively we're filming double tap strikes. So less on the technology and drone side, although drones were used, early forms of drones dropping bomblets were being utilized at that time. And it's an interesting case study, I find, because effectively a lot of the anti, if you like, propaganda on the other side being directed at the White Helmets, who are now effectively civil defense in Syria, was very strong, and it did result in the double taps against themselves and direct strikes against them, and malicious activity online, and also state apparatus being used very aggressively to be used against them at the time, and that was quite harrowing and shocking. I would take from personal experience now, this is a space that's really important. We have to be exceptionally careful as humanitarians and what entities do that. So as UNMAS, we are weapons specialists. We can absolutely know what is being used and how it's been used and stuff like this. But for instance, my priority now in Palestine, in OPT is, and in Gaza, is PC1 activity, life-saving activity. If I push team to go down advocacy lines and weapons analysis, be it on any parties using whatever weapon systems, I think that opens us up to a lot of vulnerabilities and what we're there to do. So to conduct our life-saving activity, which is effectively locate dangerous munitions, UXO, etc. If we can render them safe, I won't go into now, that's a whole other conversation. And protect civilians, population, and humanitarians themselves. Anyone, I have to be very careful. I can't suddenly turn into an weapons analysis advocacy entity. So we have to be incredibly careful. It's really important. I don't have an easy answer on this. But I've noticed from personal experience when humanitarians start, or humanitarian entities, because of their exposure, because of locations, and a lot of state governments are very interested in certain activities these groups do, because this is one of the second order effects, or could be a primary effect. Very, very delicate space, very, very careful. And I don't have a straightforward answer to that, and I think it has to be taken on a case by case basis. But I will say for ourselves now, in our experience, I've got to prioritize life-saving activity and our core mandate. So I have to be selective on that and what protects us to do that and that role. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
And to your point, Philippe, and we're going to touch more on this in session 2 about the distinctions in responses and mitigations to the different types of drones. I see, having looked at and spoken to a number of NGO security managers, that at the top end of the UAS, of long-range state-used, there's more overlap with existing mitigations with airstrikes, etc., that have been in place for a while. At the lower end of FPV drones, commercially available dual use, the issues you've mentioned, so around new applications around command and control, the disposability of them, the anonymity of them, the spread of them, they really are requiring a different approach and a rapid development of new mitigations. And this is where I see the most knowledge gaps. But we're going to step into that in the next session. Building off that question, Sarah, you mentioned in your presentation, and excuse the pronunciation, the Wassenaar Agreement, which is the voluntary control regime for dual-use technologies. The threshold, are you able to give an idea of what the threshold currently is in terms of dual-use drones? Like, would your typical Mavic drone that is used extensively in Ukraine be captured by this agreement?
Thanks, John. So unfortunately, I don't have the list, the Wassenaar list of goods memorized. But essentially, the way that the Wassenaar works is that it sets thresholds which are based on kind of technical capabilities of these systems. So they won't point out specific systems, but it'll be technical capabilities that are, range, how far a drone can fly, also kind of the parts and components of these drones. So it kind of includes these technical aspects. And this is both a pro and a con, of course, because anything that is above that threshold and would be subject to the Wassenaar. But on the other hand, producers could look at these thresholds and produce a system that just falls underneath. So it's a double-edged sword. So unfortunately, I don't have kind of the specific list in mind, but it is accessible online. But what happens is that this is discussed yearly between experts to kind of update the list. But nonetheless, there is, and this is part of the capabilities-based approach. When you focus just on capabilities, then you have the ability for manufacturers to try to fall under the threshold to exactly avoid some of these export controls. So I hope that sort of answers your question.
To take a solutions-oriented approach, have you got an example of, or a precedent of previous situation where dual-use technologies were falling through the gaps, but where the systems have been able to evolve to capture them better?
Right now, off the top of my mind, no, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I can continue thinking on your question.
The UN Global Service Center then a fixation or a focus on aerial vehicles. Naval, submersible, terrestrial uncrewed systems are already a reality. We are using this approach in UNGSC to support partners. If not done, we may need to redo all of the diplomatic, political, normative and operational effort for the sea and terrestrial dimension. And I think this is a great point. And Christina, because you're sitting next to me, I'll come to you first, but I'll come to you, Sarah and Luke as well.
No, I think it's a really important point, and I'm really thinking about this whole issue. So what can we learn from these sort of different systems, and thinking about the different vehicles of delivering these explosives for how practical policies have to be designed. And so I think it does matter what platform it comes on, because that's obviously whether it is in water or land, that's obvious. But I think the other key thing is also that we should never just focus on the technology, but need to think of the interaction between the technology that would come through water, ground, or air in relation to what the activity is that aid agencies want to do. And I think it is really from the perspective of people here in the room, that's what we need to bring together. And we need to understand which aid activity is at risk from something that's ground delivered, water delivered, or air delivered. And so it's really a discussion on bringing these things together. And that's the challenging thing that requires different experts around the table.
And one thought that occurs to me is that in terms of the accessibility, the terrestrial naval autonomous platforms are not quite as accessible and not quite as cheap. But I can imagine there being a big issue especially for naval, in terms of that same element of anonymity that can come. Luke or Sarah, do you have anything to weigh into on this question?
Sorry, would you mind repeating the question? I missed part of it.
Importance of in any work that's being undertaken to not have to ensure we're inclusive of terrestrial unmanned systems and naval unmanned systems, not just aerial.
Thanks a lot, John. Yeah, indeed. Actually, we recently did a piece of research on UMS, so uncrewed maritime systems, and their uses and kind of how they're evolving. And we have found, and this is accessible again if you go on the QR code. I didn't touch upon it in this presentation, but we have found a big growth in the use of these systems. Again, technology has improved a lot, enabling a wide range of systems, both those that operate on the surface but also underwater. And well, the report goes into a lot of detail, but just to say there are a lot more producing states, a lot more kind of states using kind of the maritime domain, kind of maritime systems, so kind of a congestion in the maritime domain as well. We also looked at kind of like attacks and lethal use by these systems, and we found incidents where these systems, again, kind of we see similar trends to in the aerial domain, where these systems can have both kind of a big impact on infrastructure and human lives. Of course, the scale is much different, but we are seeing a trend in that direction. With regards to ground systems, you're absolutely right, John. The capabilities are kind of a bit different. There's a lot more challenges when it comes to the use of ground vehicles, because the kind of geography that they have to navigate is much more difficult. So of course, you can have your autonomous, tanks, or as an autonomous navigation, just to clarify. But navigation can be a bit more challenging, or the movement on the ground can be a lot more challenging. But we are also seeing developments in this domain, so increase, and this is again in the trend of increasing the remote warfare aspect. So we are seeing also trends in developing more kind of uncrewed systems across all domains of operations, so land, air, sea, but for me, I think the two domains which are perhaps more, I'd say, urgent to prioritize is, of course, the aerial, which has been for some time, but increasingly now the maritime.
Thank you. Luke, anything there?
I haven't got a huge amount to add. That's been said already. Again, I think this is important to go back to the training and the operator side, the understanding of IHL and law of armed conflict and stuff. And you're having very large kinetic weapons, potentially be it land or undersurface, surface, naval, in the hands of these very junior soldiers, sailors, airmen. Yeah, and I think the implications of their use in an environment where they don't understand the full spectrum of civilian population and humanitarian space as well, I think is concerning. I think also, just a quick added point, but I won't say this in direct experience, the proliferation of these systems potentially falling in the hands of non-state armed groups, looking at hitting supply chains, cargo vessels, so stuff that might not necessarily be directly related to flagged humanitarian, but certainly impacting, take WFP's case, of complete supply chain issues when it comes to hitting large grain vessels and stuff like this. So I think that, and fuel. So yeah, there's a lot of points to consider, but that's my quick take from the field analysis. I'll just quickly add, when I mentioned the armored vehicle use, it's being utilized now in ground-based UAV. So you ground system on the ground being used in Gaza. That I think actually took root in Syria with non-state armed groups, with Daesh and ISIS and stuff. So you saw armored vehicles being actually utilized by a non-state armed group first, and now that is transitioned over to state use. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Question from Jeremy Wellard at ICFA.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Really interesting discussion. In terms of the impact on operations, I'm wondering if there's any work being done looking at the adaptations that organizations are putting into place in their programming, or potential chilling effects, whether from donors or otherwise. I mean, is there any work looking at that sort of second sphere in terms of the impact, not directly as well, on personnel? Thanks.
Yes, I think that in our aggregation of NGO approaches, which I'll talk to in the next session, there is some, but I'll save that because I think you also looked at that, didn't you, Christina? Or correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, so I think this is a really important issue. I would say generally there probably isn't as much done as should be done, but there are some sort of very clear programmatic implications. So one concrete example there was a drone attack on a group of lactating mothers in northern Ethiopia. And then as a result, very programmatic changes were made. So they were no longer asking them to all come at the same time and hundreds of people being there, but staggered it, that there were just groups of 5 or 10s and put it over a longer period of time. So that's a very programmatic change that was introduced from the hospitals, certainly in Myanmar. They've also implemented a lot of changes in terms of geographically taking apart the areas where patients were, where the operations are, where the recuperation is, where the food is prepared, because that way you reduce the risk that everything is affected in one incident. So these are just some examples of where I've seen real programmatic changes in terms of how the ground delivery is changed to respond to these threats. But I think usually it happens after a horrible incident, and then programmatic people turn to their security risk managers and says, can we have some help? And I think there is a big need to create greater awareness that this is built in preemptively rather than a reaction to something tragic.
Yeah. Some other examples are reduced dwell time, very similar building, same principles behind what Christina said. Reduced dwell times for distributions, reduced notification to beneficiaries that a distribution will be taking place, which will then necessitates having much stronger communications and relationships with communities so that you can be that agile like that. The question marks around convoys and how much you can move at one time, how much your logistics chain can move, and then whether or not you take a nodal approach to the protection of your infrastructure. By that I mean, do you disperse infrastructure or do you have a centralized infrastructure which you harden significantly? So there's a lot of there's no right answers, but there's a lot of questions. Please.
Hi, René Holbach from the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs. I just wanted to complement some of Sarah's points on the export control regimes and say that, another limiting factor they have is that their membership is sort of frozen in time from when they were created in the 80s and 90s. So a lot of current producers of these systems or components are not members and are therefore not bound by it. The biggest example being China, which is a member of neither of the MTCR nor of the Wassenaar Agreement.
Thank you very much. I've got one more question online. I've got two more questions online. Have there been any cases of drones being used to disperse chemical payloads, CS gas, etc.? I mean, there are elements in Ukraine of using flammable liquids that I don't know of any. Has someone got an answer? No? In the room? Please.
Quite simply, yes. In eastern Ukraine, drones have been used to disperse CS gas and other types of like mustard equivalent style gas or chlorine gas. Yeah. So.
Have you recorded that? In our sector, underreporting is the biggest issue in terms of creating a picture. Have you picked up anything along that line in the data sets that are being captured?
There are a few allegations, but this is one of the sort of very complicated issues because there can be prohibited substances, so then it becomes much more complicated to make claims around this having happened. So we would err on the side of caution, not because that's not our aim to identify particular breaches of contractual obligations, but rather to understand the pattern. So we've always been very careful when we've seen these allegations, but there clearly is information coming through that people believe it's also used that way. But yeah, it's much more complicated, to be sure, without sort of detailed ground investigations. Yeah.
Thank you. Phil Candy, Midair.
Good morning. I'm Phil Candy, Senior Security Advisor with Medair. I just wanted to make a comment or a couple of comments as we're kind of thinking about setting the scene. In terms of the sort of the small quadcopter first-person view drones, and just reflecting on the rise, we've spoken about the proliferation of those, but just I think we kind of need to assume that we will see that more and more, even in extremely low-tech conflicts. So where we might see, because these things are so easy to use and so relatively cheap, that where you might have a very small scale conflict dominated by small arms, we're seeing these drones used because they're so cheap, so easy to use. Something else to throw in, the kind of gamification of this, where we're seeing states actually starting to train young people in the use of this, taking those dual use drones and the sort of the gamification and the training starting very young. And something else just to throw in there, the accuracy of them, because they're live. And then just thinking about the data that Christina was sharing in terms of the strikes on aid workers and how accurate these things are. And so whereas we might be operating in conflicts where there is always a risk of being hit by munitions, the fact that these things are so accurate and needing to think about whether we're targeted or not. Just wanting to throw those things in. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil. I've got one more question online. And yourself. I'll do this one. I'll come to you. Thank you. There are, in terms of the emerging developments around drone operations and tactics, there are reports of mine-laying drones, mothership drones. The impact on the field remains highly volatile. To what extent can these developments be assessed and, I assume, captured to better understand the trade-offs that are required between getting tactical advantage and the impact on humanitarians and civilians? Where can a line be drawn? Marco Fontana, I apologize if I've butchered that question. But if I can put it to the group. Luke, you mentioned when we spoke before around the importance of collaboration between aid agencies to be able to better capture what's happening, what are the advances, what are the new tactics being seen. Did you want to speak to that a little bit more?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'll just emphasize it again. It's clear, this complexity of systems use-led approaches. It's more important than ever for humanitarians, UN, red systems, blue, red Cross, collaborating and sharing information. And we already see it, like in my world and mine action, the ICRC will have weapons specialists, we have weapons specialists. It's always good to have dialogue and talk to each other. Particular INGOs who specialize in mine action again. For me, being in the position I'm in at the moment, UNMAS, we see ourselves, our mandate to be a coordinating body. So I'm very interested in having a collaborative approach and a sectorial approach to these sort of issues and problems. I think the other agencies are larger than others and have maybe more security officers, better access to IM systems, satellite imagery, etc. It's generally collaborative as well, but I think it comes down to these getting increasingly technical and these specialist skills which are required, it's really important we all talk to each other. So just want to emphasize that point again. It's something I don't think we can afford not to do, and organizations shouldn't work in silo. Thank you.
A final question, madam.
Hi, thanks so much for this very rich discussion. Wendy McClinchy from Civic. I'm going to sneak in two questions. One is there's an article in the New York Times this morning about some technology trends on drone countermeasures that was really interesting. And it's the first time I'd read about essentially the development of laser technology as a countermeasure and the potential promise it holds for reducing the financial cost essentially and the feasibility for drone countermeasures from something in Ukraine like $1 million Patriot missile to 10 cents per shot of a sort of laser. Anyway, just wanted to ask those of you, maybe Luke and Sarah with arms expertise, is it possible that we are in this gap moment now of a couple of years where we see this enormous increase in the use of drones, but which eventually technology may catch up to help mitigate the threat? And therefore, should we be focusing on sort of near-term solutions, in the field while we're doing all of the rest of the sort of policy, IHL, accountability, sort of advocacy work? And then the second lighter question is on concrete ideas for some of the knowledge exchange that the speakers all recommended. Maybe we can get into that in the third panel of the day, but I would love to just unpack that and brainstorm some ways that the folks in this room might be able to take some forward steps on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. For your first question on the tech-based mitigations, Sarah, can I ask you to respond to that? And Christian, if you maybe want to come in as well.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the question. Indeed, I also read the article. It's quite interesting. Yeah, so there's a number of kind of counter UAS measures, which range in terms of their efficacy, the type of UAS they kind of can counter, and their cost. And yeah, there has been, I feel like, a growth of interest, or there's been kind of a constant interest in kind of what we call lasers, which are part of directed energy weapons. So another element is the ones that kind of counter the electronics of drones to get them to stop working. The lasers is an interesting element because, yes, there's this famous price per shot, which is much cheaper than kind of the cost of the missile. But of course, the system itself is expensive. So there is that to take into account. The other thing is, I think it's an interesting premise. There are some kind of physical limitations to the use of lasers. So essentially, it's light, which will get dispersed if there's rain, clouds, etc. So there are these also just physical limitations to their efficacy under certain circumstances. I think we should be also mindful that they're not kind of like a miracle solution, but it's an interesting solution. Unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you, or kind of maybe the answer to that $1 million question of where is the tech going. So far, we've seen kind of the tech and counter tech trends continue onwards, so that kind of dynamic. And at this point, I think there's always going to be someone who's able to somehow evade the counter tech. I don't know in the future if there will be an end to this cycle. So unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that part of the question.
Christian, do you have a
Yeah, you bet. So I'll speak extensively to electronic countermeasures in my portion, but I think that you hit the nail right on the head, Wendy. We're in a gap moment right now where we're definitely playing catch up. I'll definitely echo Sarah's points about laser concepts or laser weapon systems. Obviously going to be very expensive. Where humanitarians are doing their programming, very unlikely to see that reach that type of area in the very near future. And then there's certainly the question that we'll talk about in the next portion, certainly the third portion, about at what point does a humanitarian start to enter into that combatant space, okay, if they're using electronic countermeasures to mitigate drones. So yeah, great point, something we need to think about.
And on your second part of your question, Wendy, for the next two sessions, we'll be talking a bit more about knowledge exchange. We have reached time for that session perfectly, so thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much to our speakers, to Sarah, Luke and Christina, and for your questions. We will be resuming in 15 minutes. Is that all I need to say?
20 maybe.
Okay. Any other housekeeping that I need to pass on? No. All right. Thank you very much.